right, folks, welcome to another episode of Beyond the Noise, Signals, Stories, and Spicy Takes, the show where we dig into the stories of the people shaping the future of app-based computing with a special focus on mobile. I'm your host, Matt Klein, co-founder and CTO of Bitdrift, as well as the founder of Envoy Proxy. Each episode will talk with engineers, founders, and technical leaders who've transformed the way their companies build and understand what's happening inside their systems. We'll dig into the challenges, the breakthroughs, the lessons learned, and we'll wrap it all up with their hottest takes. So let's dive in. Today, I'm thrilled to have with us Aaron He, who is an engineering director for the client platform team at Tinder, responsible for infrastructure, stability, and performance for all client apps at Tinder. He joined Tinder nearly a decade ago as an Android engineer, initially focused on growth projects, before building out the Android and iOS platform teams. Aaron, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, fantastic. A lot to talk about, but would love to start with just learning about you. So tell us, how did you get into mobile? What excites you about mobile? How did you choose Android versus iOS? And then we can just take it from there.
Yeah, how did I get into mobile? So I think a while ago when I graduated after grad school, got a job and doing like web CMS basically for like the contractors. We have big clients like Samsung, NBC Universal. Usually it's more about managing the contract workers' time. So clock in, clock out. At the time, a lot of competitors also have started building mobile apps. So we thought it would be a good idea because you always such a big challenge where, when you're clocking in and clocking out, it's super convenient, super easy to have a mobile app with you. And so we start building out the mobile app, and also for their managers be able to approve that very easily, very quickly. I think that we started building out mobile apps for that. And then at the time, we were basically pretty much a C# shop. So at the time, and that was like maybe 2012. Because since we were already a C# shop, so I was a very big proponent of Xamarin at the time. I had some experience with Xamarin.
Yeah.
And then doing, because it was a really small company, so we don't think it would be a little bit more expensive to fund a dedicated mobile team with iOS expertise, hiring, and also Android expertise as well. So we decided to just land on Xamarin because we can share all the business logic with the backend, and then we just built an app that would work for both Android and iOS. So that's how I got into mobile. We did a start trial with Xamarin and it worked really well. I actually, even though I started as an Android engineer at Tinder, a funny story is I actually never had an Android phone. Before that, I actually had a Windows phone because I was much more of a C# guy, working on a lot of web services in C#.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I was,
and before that was BlackBerry.
Yeah, I think you and I are probably one of the 10 people that actually had a Windows phone, probably. Anyway, sorry, keep going.
Yeah. Yeah, so at the time I actually started because it was the time that when iPhone 4 was released, maybe just a year or 2 years ago at the time. I was really amazed by the Retina display and stuff, so that was got me motivated to get an iPhone as my daily driver. And then so I was really wanted to, hey, I want to focus on more on the iOS side. However, my tech lead at the time, I also joined the company very new, so he actually wanted to do iOS, so I kind of just like back off. I actually tried 3 times just to say, hey, I want to, because there's a couple of people there's another person was also going to focus on iOS, but then he left, and then I said, hey, this would be another opportunity for me to get back into iOS, and because I was new, and tech lead said no, and I kept on Android, but I actually had a lot of fun with Android. I had no idea about how welcome the open source community at the time it was. I think that we basically ported a lot of libraries from was Java based and ported into C#. I learned a lot in terms of knowing the difference between Java. I think pretty much that was still Java 6 at the time, and versus C#, already pretty much advanced as a programming language. So I had a lot of fun learning both. And comparing both. I think I personally ported, a called Times Square library from Square at the time. It was showing a table view of calendar. I thought that was fun, and and also trying to compare some performance, to either any scroll hitches and stuff like that. That was pretty fun. I think I also collaborated with someone else in the community on a bringing action bar to Xamarin. However, I didn't pick the one who later became the foundation of app compile library at Google for Android. However, we picked a different one, but that was also had a lot of fun just porting that into Xamarin.
Did you ever, find that you were porting so much code to C# that you, I guess, question whether you should just be writing a native app in the first place? I mean, I don't know.
That's a good question, because I think that's actually also the time of find, hey, why Android kind of stuck in Java 6 for Java 8 or Java 6 at the time for a very long time. So that's where when I learned there's a project called Kotlin. I know Kotlin is pretty much the programming language for Android today, but that was 12 years ago when it was in milestone 1 or 2 or something like that. That's where I started learning about Kotlin. And that's a pretty fun language. And I think it was maybe 2013 when Jake Warden from Square actually had a full-on proposal of advocating for Kotlin usage. And in their code base, that's where I learned a lot more detail about Kotlin, and I feel like, yeah, if ever happening, being officially supported, that would be a really, really nice.
I mean, it seems like in the mobile space, there's been all of these runs up against having like cross-platform technology, right? Like obviously you were talking about Xamarin. Today we have React Native and Flutter. I don't know. I'm not a mobile developer myself, and it just seems like, I don't know, like the industry goes through cycles of where we're going to do cross-platform. Like, no, we're going to do native code. Like, no, we're going to do web apps. No, now we're going to do cross-platform again. And I don't know. I would just love to learn more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's based off the use case. I think there's industry have gone back and forth. There was an infamous article from, I believe, at Airbnb at the time, say, hey, we're no longer going to invest more in React Native, stuff like that, right? I think that it was also based on one of the engineer on my team. He recently, maybe a couple of years ago, moved on to a company. His background is around Android, love strongly typed languages. However, he moved on to a company, a small startup. They do have mobile apps, but purely based on React Native. I just chatted with him a couple of months ago, and he said, "Well, I don't think we ever need it in the next 2 or 3 months, next 2 or 3 years, because they are still trying to market fit." I think having a mobile app that easily at the time, where you're still focusing on growing the business, maybe that's his real primary focus. And even though they do have really strong iOS and Android engineers, however, I think that for them in that stage of business, probably it makes sense for them continue to invest in React Native at that stage, and also when company goes bigger, I know there's a lot of sharing code has always been a topic, especially recently. I think within our teams, we're also debating or discussing heavily about whether we should invest more in Kotlin multi-platform. That's always been a topic. I think that we, from a business perspective, always feel it's not always a silver bullet as in software. There's you always need to consider a lot of trade-offs between maybe you do gain developer productivity by hiring a lot of but there's also a cost in terms of managing I've heard stories where wanted to port an existing app to even have React Native coexisting with native stack. That will take tremendous investment as well. And also, I think that not gonna lie, when I talk to my friend who currently still working on React Native, sometimes he is getting frustrated where there's this middle layer that you don't actually know where to start to even look into the bug. I think that's something that the pros need to be carefully evaluated before actually diving to say, hey, this is the solution for the mobile for the development stack.
I mean, it's a tough trade-off for sure. I mean, it seems like to me that all things being equal, you'd like to not duplicate code across platforms. Obviously, in the new world of LLMs porting stuff, maybe it's not as expensive, but at least from the Bitdrift side of things, I think on the client SDK, we've had a lot of benefits of writing a lot of the code actually in Rust, right? And that allows us to,
nice.
share a bunch of the code, and then we obviously have like the, like stuff on top. I would think that once you get into more of the UI side of things, it gets a bit trickier because there's so many platform specific things that are going on. But it has always surprised me, just, like lots of companies, they maintain these giant teams, right, that are like working on web and working on iOS and working on Android. And it seems like there's a lot of duplication in all the features that are actually being made.
Yeah. I agree. I totally agree. I think especially with like you said about UI, I think Tinder is famous for, the swiping gesture. I think it actually will be a lot of difficult because we are doing a lot of low level animation APIs that
Right. Yep.
can be very tricky to share. That we can abstract as much as possible, but the way, I think especially with Android, that animation has gone through such evolution in terms of the API design and everything. I think
Sure.
it's just a little bit difficult, take a lot of time to provide abstraction layer that makes sense for both platforms.
Yeah. All right. So let's go back. So you were working at this small company, and you were doing some C# Xamarin development, and then tell us what happened next.
Yeah, and then I moved on. There was an opportunity. I think I moved on to a company called TrueCar, and then basically the business was trying to make the car buying easy because everyone hates go to the dealership, and then that was probably my first full time job as engineer at the as an engineer, because I think in the past I was still have doing some of the web full stack, mix of a lot of things, and also work on dabble a little bit, a little bit of a mobile development because of Xamarin and stuff like that. But that when going to TrueCar was my first actual job as a full-time engineer. It was also during the interview process was also pretty interesting because at the time when I was interviewing TrueCar, I was assigned a coding challenge, basically take home coding example. So I coded up the Android app they wanted to see. I wrote a lot of unit tests actually, and then I passed the interview. But then during the onsite, when they actually interview, say, hey, your app actually crashed when you rotate. So I didn't know because there was in the Xamarin world, I think they abstract really well. So later I noticed there's an attribute called portrait. That's why it was working. So basically the app was only supporting portrait mode. If you rotate, it wouldn't change to landscape. But it was my first project in full Java Android app. I didn't know there was a fit configuration like that. But they still say, hey, I was still pretty impressed by adding a lot of unit tests. The apps as long as in portrait mode it didn't crash. So I got it. We did a couple of additional rounds and got a job. And then my first task was we had at the time TrueCar had, just before I joined, like maybe 2 days ago, there was an outage where because there is a version code upgrade. However, we made a hotfix. However, the version code was lower than the production version. That was a very classic mistake at the time, and then that caused us database to downgrade, and then we didn't handle the database downgrade, so we just crashed the app. So my first job was like 2014, I think. I think the tooling is not as mature as today. So, but my task was write a test to ensure when downgrade we can recreate a database. That was at the time there wasn't there. I think Android Grid plugin just started like 0.1 alpha version or something like that. It wasn't, and then we were still majority of the engineers still using Eclipse, and then we were using Maven, a Maven plugin. So that you still need to do a lot of customization to make running an instrumentation test on Android. That was my fun. You can see as the first time as doing a full-time Android engineer, and then the first task is to actually, because of at the time the tooling, I didn't know where to start. But the first task is to actually write an instrumentation test, be able to to mimic that behavior and to avoid that crash. It was pretty. It took a lot of a lot of digging and around Maven plugins and had a lot of fun. But I think a lot of people today probably wouldn't would take that for granted. A lot of people would say, "Hey, I don't see any problem with this. It's pretty straightforward today." But it wasn't like that at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to ask more about the actual outage. I mean, because how did you fix that? If the database was upgraded or downgraded and then it was crashing all the apps, like what did they do? Did they fix the back end to like not downgrade? Like how did you get the apps back up that were in this crash loop?
So we had, if I remember correctly, we had to do another hotfix and then bump the app version. Bumping the version code actually is incrementing, so we know it's actually an upgrade, and then at the same time to prevent people from crashing the app, we also actually the way we handle the downgrade was just recreating the database from scratch. So just start over. I think that was the hotfix we made at the time.
Oh, I see. So people ended up losing their data basically, right? Or it was
yeah. Fortunately, it was the database was just on the client. So when they recreate the data and resync with the server, everything will be recovered. But it just I guess also it was and also because we didn't handle the downgrade scenario, and it just crashed. I think so. People pretty much can't use the app until they reinstall the app and start over again. So I think that kind of avoids that scenario where the period of time that data loss, that could be a little bit difficult. Imagine now it was like almost 11 years ago, that would be very, very difficult to recover from.
I mean, that type of bug can certainly still happen today. I'm sure it happens to people all the time. I think it's a great example of how difficult mobile development is, just because you wind up with all of these different versions out in the wild and you can't really control it at all.
Yeah. We actually just had a bug a couple of weeks ago that we saw some of our metrics that were dropping, and the reason for that is there is a flag that actually only matters for internal users, and then because that flag, some of the data we need is coming from a service that we haven't caught. That we did some migration of the underlying infrastructure, and then causing that flag, fetching that flag actually is hung until that flag coming from the right database. Coming from the right backend. So those kind of events weren't being sent because they were just still waiting for the flag to arrive, and it never arrived. So we actually never able to, the app, it was hung in the background, so it wasn't didn't cause any performance regression. However, we did lost a lot of events, and then one thing that the data engineering team was asking, hey, can we backfill this data? We were felt like that was just impossible because we didn't really construct the event, because that in order to construct the event, that field is still waiting the data to arrive. So I think that was still, like you said, it's still very relevant today. That just one of the most recent bugs we had, unfortunately.
Well, that, and especially if you're driving a lot of your business metrics off of client-side events. I know there's a whole discussion of people, that talk about whether you should derive them from server-side events or client-side events, and obviously, probably if they can be accurately measured from the server, that might be better. But obviously, there's certain types of things that you only know if they happen on the client, right? So, I mean, it's a tough situation. Obviously, is getting all of this data be accurate over all the different app releases and all the different backend deployments and all of those things that happen.
Yeah, that's a debate. Is this data can be derived or persisted on the data engineering side versus just getting that on the client side? That has always been a very kind of contentious point that, at least at Tinder, we always argue back and forth. Hey, if this data can just infer or derive from the backend, or data engineering can keep track of record of, should we still send that field on the client side? That has always been a debate. Right. For my past 10 years here.
Yeah. All right, so
Yeah.
let's come back to your career. So you were at the car company, and then what?
And then they made a decision to lay off the entire mobile team.
Oh,
It was I still to this day I don't know exactly what was the decision. I think TrueCar still has a mobile app today. However, I think they did a switch from a native mobile app to a React Native at the time. I haven't checked their apps to see what their development stack is, but at least that was the couple months after the layoff. They did release a new app which purely based on a React Native. So maybe there's a little bit personal bias because of that in terms of native versus React Native. However, I think that's where I start looking and find a job and landing a job at Tinder, and been here almost 10 years now.
and I guess you joined Tinder as a line level engineer, right? You said working on Android.
Yes.
So tell us a bit about your time there in terms of obviously you've gone from being an Android engineer to now you're managing a bunch of people across different platforms. So would love to learn more about that journey.
Yeah. So I joined Tinder. We worked on a couple of growth projects. One project was at the time I think Tinder was only you can only log in through Facebook. So there's obvious growth opportunity to let's open more to people who have a phone, who have a support SMS logging. But because at the time it's not just supporting SMS logging using your phone number, but also at the time we only supporting Facebook logging, but Facebook gave you a lot of information, gave you kind of a shortcut your onboarding process. So we also had to rethink about how
Right,
we
makes
do
sense.
onboarding when we only know your phone number, but that's pretty much the only information we have. So I think that was kind of a 6 months or almost a year project to make sure we have a good onboarding process and have a phone you can log in through phone number rather than relying on Facebook. And then and at the time I feel like there was a need. No one really talks about if we can improve the efficiency of the engineering team by providing some frameworks. I think at the time I think Marshmallow was just released maybe in 2015, and then that was they introduced a runtime permission. So basically, we need to ask for permission rather than it was all at the time. I think Android was all the permission was you declare in manifest. When you install, you'll be asked to see if you wanted to accept all the permission. That was we didn't really. It wasn't the platform didn't support to ask permission at runtime to be more contextual of what you've been doing. So when that released, there was a couple of places where like getting your photos or using your camera or using a location. We feel like if we build an underlying creating a good abstraction layer around how when you ask permission and then make that process easier, so we don't need to kind of reinvent the underlying wheels for many places. I feel like that's what really excites me, and always be excited to for me as creating a good abstraction layer to improve the efficiency, improve the productivity of engineering team. So that's where I started to feel like, hey, that's maybe something we should be doing. I think also in terms of career wise, at the time, I remember my manager asked me on my first day, or like maybe it's always ongoing career conversation. Hey, what do you aspire your career goals? I always had an answer like I don't want to go into EM role because I really enjoy being IC. I think part of me today still I enjoy some of the IC work. I think that we can get into that maybe a little bit later. But I think that at the time, but however, when I see that need, I feel like no one is actually speaking up to the leadership team. Say, hey, this is actually absolutely a need. We can how much. There's a lot of many other examples like that. Creating good abstraction layer on the data layer or something similar. I think that I've seen people developing features basically just reinventing a lot of a common infrastructure all the
Yeah.
time, but no one really talked to management team about there's such a void of if we can invest in time maybe working on this infrastructure piece for 1 month. However, we can duplicate a lot of work for other feature teams, working on similar features. So I had a really good manager and a mentor. Still today, I think he and I would still talk pretty much every month. And, every now and then we would talk. He's still my external coach, a mentor till today. But at the time, he's like, hey, why don't you read this management book and then start thinking about how you want to build a team and how you wanted to making sure those voices are heard. I feel like, yeah, that's a very different challenge than I was expecting at the time. But I think if, my goal at the time was just really wanted to make sure we are spending the resources, investing in this area.
Yeah.
So I think that, yeah, I'll up for the challenge and then start building on the team.
I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. I think one question that I would love to ask you is, I think from an industry perspective, we do a really bad job of like measuring whether things like abstraction layers and all of those things, like, are they actually saving people time, right? And I think sometimes as an industry, we can get into almost like analysis paralysis, if that makes sense, meaning like we can talk about
Yes.
whether it's worth it for longer than it would take to do it. And sometimes you just have to go by your intuition and say, like, this makes sense. We should do this. So, but that's my own thinking. Like, I would love to ask you, when you're thinking about some of these topics, like you were in IC, you were thinking about doing some things that would lead to greater developer efficiency, even though that's very hard to measure. I don't know if you had those conversations with your management at the time, and it's like they were asking you, is this worth it? Like, how do we know if it's worth it? So just would love to learn from you a bit more. Like, how do you think about that? How do you think about measuring or not measuring, some of these things, that are related to things like developer productivity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's so many angles I can talk about.
Go
It's a
ahead.
question
Yeah.
I've been constantly thinking about every single day. We just had this. We want to introduce a tool to measure engineering productivity. I put a lot of thoughts together to how should we measure engineering productivity. But if we are talking about, like you said, in analysis paralysis, that's very, very true. I think my first a reaction would be, I think, is how much trust you have with your manager. I think a lot of times that manager I talk about was I worked on infrastructure project for almost 2 years on and off. Every time, I think I have the API ready for like in 2 weeks or something, but the migration of that infrastructure took me almost 2 years. For sure, I wasn't always 100% full-time dedicated to that. However, it did take a long time, to be able to have your manager be able to fund you this project for that 2 years. It needs tremendous trust from the management team that they also believe in. So I don't need to write up, hey, this because, this is a piece of infrastructure. Every feature use like currently today, they take 5 days to develop it, but with this new infrastructure, they can only take like a day or something. I didn't really need to do all that. Also the funny story at the time was, I think 6 months in the project, and the manager asked me, how long do you think we'll finish all this? I told him maybe 1 more month, and that kept going for the next maybe 12 months. Just keep telling him it'll be finished in a month. I think he gave up at one point. But I think that just also, I think that trust is very, very critical, where I guess the trust come from they understanding the problem really well, and also trust also comes from this cycle of you say what you're gonna deliver and deliver what you said, right? I think that maybe from the past, I really never asked him like why you trusted me at the time, but I think probably as due to like he and I would work together for quite a bit of time and before,
I
and
think
then
so,
that
for
he can
sure.
know,
Yeah.
yeah, he wouldn't know that I will deliver this, but also at the same time, he also understands I'm not. It's a piece of infrastructure work that migration will take some time because I wasn't really dedicated 100% full time on this. So there was some expectation. Say I said 1 month, but it was more about if I were to dedicate this myself 100% of the time, you know, for the migration. So I think that trust is probably number one thing if they see the same problems as you do, so that you can avoid a lot of can be a lot more efficient in terms of getting that project kicked off, getting that project funded.
Yeah. I mean, that's been my own experience within my own career, which is that I agree with what you said. I mean, I think you have to build credibility typically on smaller projects and ones that might have value, whether they're for product value or you've helped some other developer do something and they say, like my life clearly got better. And then I think over time that expands in scope where you're allowed to take on larger and larger projects just based on intuition, right? That like this makes
Yeah,
sense. And at least for me,
yeah,
speaking for myself, I think that's how I've gotten out of a lot of the analysis paralysis cycles where I think if you build that credibility, eventually people just start believing that you have the intuition and you're saying like, this is probably going to save people time. So like, let's just go and do it. But yeah, I mean, it always interests me because I do think that sometimes organizations, they just pause, like they don't get anything done because they can't prove it. But then like they wind up in this cycle of not doing anything because they can't prove it. And it's like some things it's really hard to prove, I guess, with like data.
yeah,
Anyway.
yeah. Yeah, I think, like you said, I think starting small is definitely the key. Even with that for that 2 year project, I finished initial API design, which I think pretty much, I think the only big change since today was we switched from RxJava to coroutine. But I think all the access pattern, all the APIs pretty much stay the same. I finished that in a couple of weeks and with all the testing. Then I think also that was give them a little bit more confidence. Hey, that we should start look into this, and then started migrating a couple of teams, and they immediately also get the benefit. So people will know, it's just a matter of time when we migrate that over 100%. It will take time, but at least the direction we're going is good. So we don't end up with like, hey, we are just investing very very invest big upfront, but then there's always this sunk cost fallacy, right? Should we is it I think so starting small, doing little by little, I think continue to earn that trust and that credibility is definitely the key here. I will say that I think that also the bigger challenge though is I think like how do we avoid an analysis paralysis is for me personally I think the bigger challenge is when your management. I think that's often probably happen more often than not that your management team is not on the same page of the way you see the problem. Right, that's where is the biggest challenge is. At which I, encounter so many kind of cases like this. But I think for me personally, it is actually also a growth opportunity. Is because that's been bothering me. Like why they're not seeing the problem. One thing I learned the most is probably is there, we're all engineers, we all had engineering background. I think just the way they, from different angle looking at the problem, I think that figure out, a way that goes to a lot of communication skills where they may see you and your manager may not see the problem eye to eye from what you'd be understanding. But if you put yourself into their shoes, maybe from their angle, explain the problem in an angle that where they can understand or they can be more relevant to. I think that's a lot of times it's an incredible challenge, and also I think myself can learn a lot from that process. And I think an example I keep referring to is many years ago we wanted to consolidate CI. So there at the time we on the mobile team on Android we were using a vendor A, and then the iOS team using another different vendor, and the backend team they have their own self-build on top of Jenkins. I think though, so the initiative, however, did start from the teams that within the backend team. So they of course they are selling their own solution to us. So for us, I maybe have taken too much granted at the time that it's just so straightforward for me to see that that infrastructure probably wouldn't work for us. But I'll be able the process of convincing that team, in the leadership team, that this is not a good idea for mobile. Myself have learned a lot, like why CI. It seems like they for maybe for the backend team, especially at the time where they have a fast rollback. So in case there are any, so you can see there's a little bit less need to invest in CI to make sure to make sure you assess as many as error. Maybe that need isn't as prominent as mobile because we can't roll back. A mobile app, once you release, it's out there, right? Like if those people experience those downgrade crashes, they will continue to, unless you make a new app. We can't just simply pull it back, especially those issues on client. So as that made me realize why it's so critical for the CI for mobile. I think at the time I would just took it for granted, but through that process, trying to understand from where they're coming from, why they built such infrastructure, and focus on a couple areas that's very different from what we would have to focus on if we would build this infrastructure ourselves. I think throughout that process, I actually learned quite a ton in terms of the actual, what the difference between mobile versus backend. I think what the maybe you sound super on the surface may sound super straightforward. You're releasing the app store. And the other side, you are just pretty much self-control. You can your environments a lot than mobile, but that there's a lot of unintended or not unintended, but there's more nuanced stuff because of that release model is so different. I think that I learned a lot of I learned a ton from this, learned a way to communicate that better, as be able to convince them, hey, we should shift our priority to actually to focus on those a few things that actually really matter for mobile.
Yeah, I think there's that skill for sure. Is, I don't know, people call it different things, like managing up, managing sideways, all of those things.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to ask you though, and this would be your experience both managing up and also for you as a manager, is I think sometimes in my own experience, for people in management who, as you said, like most or all of them have a common engineering background, is sometimes like as you get further and further away from the code, like it's hard to empathize with what's actually going down, right? Or like what is happening with the boots on the ground, as it were. And I think that can sometimes lead to an impedance mismatch, which is that if someone, whatever, had been like a mobile engineer or some kind of engineer, but they haven't done line level work for years, they might be out of date on just like how things are working. I think it's a two-part question, is that, for you, since you went from a line level engineer to EM, now to a, managing teams and all of those things, you must have dealt with this when you were dealing with management, but then you as a manager now must have some of the same problems. So would love to learn from you a bit more, like how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's also I will come back to the trust as well. How much the engineers on my team, they're in the deep, either in the weeds of dealing with a lot of infrastructure issues, or that you as me, not just only the trust, but also empathetic to those problems, rather than just kind of brush it under the rug or something like that. Oh, that's not a problem. We will deal with it. We'll just deal with it or something like that. I think that trust and empathetic of the situation. I think also another thing that I think I said a little bit earlier. I do miss a lot of IC time, and I try my best to get back in, find some time, be able to write some code, not for sure, not critical path of the app, but at least be able to try out the API, the new frameworks, stuff like that, especially within this large code base, because, a lot of times if you're doing like a demo app, the challenge is so different than working actually in a legacy app, with millions of lines code and, hundreds of contributors at the same time. I think so I think I still wanted to myself try, whenever I have time, whenever is there an urgent issue. I think the recent analytics reporting bug was also another example where I tried to, even just reverting the PR, actually be able to, for me personally, do that, realizing there's a lot of risk if we just simply revert, be able to build the app myself. I think that can help me to understand a little bit more the problem. I don't think that it's still a career goal that I aspire to be still closer to the field as much as possible. But I can definitely see, the contributions. I used to, I think when I first became a manager, still pretty much involved in writing code. We did a big, 5-team project at the time, and I was working more of integrating between, legacy code and into bringing the new SDK into the legacy code base. I think that, but I can see that kind of a contribution just dropped significantly as
Yeah.
much, as today. I think last year probably only had less than 10 PRs or something, But I think I still, end of the day, I think I still would wanted to try to understand the problem a little bit better, especially myself. I think there's an example where we did a large migration where a lot of people were complaining about the API, actually my team designed. And then, of course, I trust my team, but at the same time, I trust their judgment. The people who gave me the feedback feel empathetic about their feedback as well. So what I did was just try and help out the migration myself, and I did find out, there's definitely a lot of room to improve and push the team to make the API. I think more about API design a little bit better, and smooth the transition period, smooth the migration.
Yeah.
You know,
I've
yeah.
I've I've seen people write online who are managers, and I myself am not a manager. I'm one of the odd people that have been in IC their entire career. And I've seen people write that in the new age of Claude Code and LLMs and coding agents and all of these things, it makes it easier a bit actually for managers to dip their heads back in the code. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think that's true. Especially I think right now I do see where even for product managers, non-technical people, they're starting using a lot of those AI coding tool, a lot as well. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So tell us a bit more, just from your team's perspective. What are the big challenges that you're facing right now? Like, what are the biggest problems in mobile development that you see both within Tinder as well as within the industry?
Yeah, for my team, I think we spent last couple of quarters and we're really focusing on improving our app performance. I think crashes were pretty okay. I think on iOS, we had been historically have been like 396, 397 that we're pretty happy about. Usually it was 395. I think that was, it's pretty happy about. However, I think that app hand ANR is definitely to be able to detect them as early as possible and be able to find out the root cause as early as as quickly as possible. I think that's probably the two biggest challenges right now for the team, because for app hand ANR, similar to auto memory, you get a stack tree that most of the time don't tell where the root cause is. I think that be able to providing a lot of signals, how can we provide a lot of signals, and how can we identify this from before the app is being released or the experiment being rolled out. I think that's very, very still as it's probably the biggest challenge for us right now.
Yeah,
It's not
I
just
mean,
for our team who are in the spotlight of driving the improving app performance, improving reducing app hands and ANRs, but also for the feature team, how can we make the tool accessible and then providing those signals for them easily, not always relying on us, help them to fix those. I think that's also a very big challenge as well.
yeah, I mean, I'm obviously biased. We founded an
Yes.
entire company based on that premise, right? Which is that for most companies, the crashes are not that big of a problem, right? So like, without getting into vendors and all of that, I'm just trying to understand a bit more. How do you think about going about actually fixing that? Because I think for a lot of teams in general, like, just measuring performance is really complicated, right? I mean, it's like coming up with consistent measurements and a baseline and all of those things. And we talked about before how, we can get into analysis paralysis, but I think for some of these changes, you do kind of have to analyze them and run experiments and make sure that you're not making things worse and all of that. So I don't know, just like wanted to learn a little more just in terms of how you think about going from the world in which like crash reporting is kind of solved, right? And now you're moving on to these more nebulous problems. How do you provide the infrastructure, I guess, that allows you to dig into that?
Yeah, some of the performance problems are easier, kind of solved than others. For example, startup time. Even though I think it's still tricky. I think PY was on the podcast before. He wrote like 13 part of the series of long blog posts to explain how do you actually measure startup time, right? I think that was also my classic example of, you think that startup time, oh, when the ARPs, when you click the icon, start the timer, and then when you see the content, stop the timer. That's it, right? Sounds so simple, but it actually is not that straightforward to get that right. You will get all sorts of different bugs from platforms, from OS versions that you don't really have control of. But I think that's already a challenge in terms of measuring it correctly. I think we were relying on different other vendors to be able to track that. But however, when we actually brought that in, wanted to track this internally, be able to rationalize data to see if there's, because we run 100 experiments every day. We want to know each experiment, do you have a regression performance? I think that's one of the problem we're trying to solve. Otherwise, because client release is only we do weekly releases. That's one thing. However, I think more often than not is those experiments that progressed on app performance, crashes, or app hands or startup time that we wanted to making sure we understand. That's just a challenge of working a little bit larger mobile team where you can't oversee all the changes. I remember before still, when I was starting at Tinder, I was able to review all the peers from the Android team. I don't think I stopped doing that maybe a few years ago, just because it just unsustainably for myself to review all the PRs, and it still cannot really prevent any regression from happening. But yeah, providing the tools, be able to know how we attribute those performance regression with each team, I think that's very, very helpful, very effective, at least for our perspective. And then providing a tool, be able to know, now we see a regression in your experiment, what are the top crashes that what are top app hands or top app crashes attributed to compared to the control group. That would be the team first. Actually, the first team, once they gone through the 5 stage of grief, because of course they will be denied. The feature is fine, but however, once they gone through that, the first question they will be asking it: how can I fix this? What's the root cause? So I think that providing that tool, be able for them to easily identify, at least knowing some signals where the problem potential could be, especially for app and ANRs, that helped a lot.
How do you? I was going to say that I feel like team attribution is still kind of an unsolved problem, or like people use heuristics and all of those things. So it's like, how do you think about that? I mean, it's like the one that I hear the most is people do it based on screen, which is obviously imperfect, but it's like, do you have any tips for people, that are attempting to look at team attribution?
Yeah, I think it's still, not gonna lie, I think it's still largely very unsolved problem. When you look at the screen, there's actually the composition of the screen could be multiple smaller views composed together. Like who actually owns this view is, and that's already a problem. But we still, I think our strategy is still looking at the screen, because this is where your team start with, start investigation, because even though an app hang could happen well before this screen, but at the end of the day, your screen conversion rate or the metrics you care about at this screen got impacted because there's app hang happened before. So your team should, at least our strategy is, should start the conversation yourselves, because you don't want it's mobile, just that the ownership can be blurry a lot of times. Unlike whereas on the backend side, you own this microservice or you don't, right? Like on the client side, and you can pretty much very self-contained for your microservice. But on mobile side, even with this different in this screen have multiple view composed together, who is actually responsible for communicating between the views? I think that's also, the ownership can be very, very blurry.
Yeah, it's a super interesting topic. I could keep talking about this. We're almost at time. So are there any other big topics that your teams are focused on right now?
Yeah, I think that's probably the number one thing, because we have seen because as Tinder grow, I think performance has been kind of being overlooked. for the past 10 years. So we did a lot of we spend a lot of time firefighting, making sure we are in a good spot. But also, I think the next stage is making sure we stop firefighting. We're providing the frameworks, providing guardrails to ensure to catch those issues as early as possible, right at the coding level. I think that's is something we're focusing on for the past quarter, and pretty much the entire year. This year probably will more around that area.
It is refreshing to not hear you say that you're focusing on artificial intelligence. I think performance is still very valid. So that's like fantastic.
Yeah. I think also just on AI, I think it's definitely a tool. But I was more thinking about is the learning from AI, because I think it's similarly maybe a bad analogy where Stack Overflow, right? That type of engineers only copy paste and it works and it just shipped, right? You never really if you're focused on learning, how can maybe AI could get you faster there, however did you learn from this? I think that's still something kind of been thinking about. I've heard people were talking about like write it twice or something, where write the first with AI, write the second time yourself, and then write the third time to actually make it properly architected. I think that how do we in age of AI be able to promote learning? As you actually grow from a junior engineer all the way to senior engineer. I think that's something that been thinking about a lot too.
Yeah, I mean that's probably as good a place to end as any. I mean, just because I think we could do a whole episode on that. It's something that I think about all the time as well. I mean, as in now in the last 6 months, I'm writing most of my code using these AI tools, and I question how we're going to train the next the next set of engineers, right? Like the people that need to be able to know how all this stuff works at a certain point. But anyway, so thank you so much for joining. I think this was a fantastic conversation. I think people are really going to enjoy it. So that's a wrap for this episode of Beyond the Noise, Signals, Stories, and Spicy Takes. Huge thanks to Aaron for joining and sharing his story. You can find this episode and all past ones on the Bitchiff YouTube channel. And if you had fun, drop us a review, tell your friends, or yell your favorite hot take into the void, and just make sure to tag us. I'm Matt Klein, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.